persecuted or pursue. Matthew 5:10. God blesses those who are persecuted for doing right, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. This verse can be translated in quite a different way. The red, blue, and orange words are those words I want to talk about today. I leave the red word, persecuted, for the last because that's the most difficult one to explain. And I will now start with the word in blue, doing right. Doing right is a Hebrew idiom, and it simply means salvation. When an ancient Hebrew heard doing right, that had for them the meaning of salvation. So that is why I retranslated the verse below with the word salvation. Depending how you understand the word theirs, it may or may not be translated wrong. But it just feels for me it might be misunderstood, and on the other hand, nobody will misunderstand it because everybody know that the King of Heaven is God, and King of Heaven is not a believer. It's not a person. It's the kingdom is owned by God. But anyway, while I think nobody will mistake in it that somebody thinks that the kingdom of heaven is ruled by an earthly person, I think the verse could be better translated as is shown below, that those people are not owning the kingdom, but they are in the kingdom. Both red words are translated from the same Greek word, and both of those words are translated correctly. But which choice you make as a translator, persecuted or pursue, depends on the context of the verse. So, once again, both words are correct translations, but you have to look at the context of the verse to understand why the word should be persecuted or pursue. As you may or may not know, the manuscripts that are the most ancient writings of the Bible were in very bad shape when the church collected them all and combined them in what we now know as the Bible. Back in the time of the apostles and until the church really started doing a big work of compiling them, it was like some people had the book of Matthew and the others had the book of Revelation, and usually they were not even complete. He had a few pages of Matthew and a few pages of Luke, and well, that was just the way it is. Those people just were persecuted, the first meaning, and they just did what they could to make copies of copies, and they spread it all around. But it was actually never complete, and the copies got damaged and stuff, and yes, there were many copies, and the scholars were able to reconstruct everything that was originally written down by the apostles. Uh, so we have a complete Bible, but it was quite a huge task to even collect all those manuscripts in Greek before even the translation into English and other languages could start. Matthew chapter 5 is the famous Sermon on the Mount by our Lord Jesus Christ. And it is this chapter that is the context for Matthew 5 verse 10 we are discussing. And it is this context that determines if the Greek words to be translated as persecuted, or pursue. Verses 11 and 12 are the context that verse 10 uses to translate the Greek word as persecuted instead of pursue, because verse 11 are about the negative interpretation of the Greek word about persecute. So the scholar said, okay, because 11 and 12 are persecution, that's why also verse 10 is about persecution instead of pursue. If that's so, where does the whole idea of pursue comes from, you may ask? All the evidence is against pursue. Well, there is some evidence that verse 11 and verse 12 do not belong in this chapter. They are somewhere part of the Bible, but in another chapter. That could be because the manuscripts were badly damaged and just fragmented, and when the Bible was reconstructed, those verses were placed in the wrong chapter, because they both, of all three I should say, verse 10, verse 11 and verse 12, all use that Greek word that can be translated as persecute and pursue. So the scholars assumed, okay, this is all about the same thing, so we place verses 11 and 12 after verse 10. And when they did that, they had to make that choice. Are we going to use persecute, or are we going to use pursue? By inserting verse 11 and 12 after verse 10, they basically make the choice. There was no other option than translated as persecute. But other scholars say, yes, it's correct. They use that same Greek word that can be translated as persecute and also as pursue, but there is proof that those verses do not belong together. Because in verse 10, the pronoun is in the third person. And in verse 11 and 12, it suddenly shifts to the second person. And for those scholars, that's a clue, well, actually, a very clear indication, as they say it, that those verses were not all three in the Sermon on the Mount. And if we just remove verse 11 and 12, then the context for verse 10 falls away, or should I say, it changes. And if you then look at the verses that are before verse 10, then an all other thing surfaces. Then the context dictates stronger towards the word pursue. Okay, to wrap up this teaching, I would like to suggest that you read Matthew 5, verse 3 until 9. You will see that all those verses, without exceptions, are positive. They are relaying a good and positive and happy message. And then suddenly, at verse 10, 11 and 12, that positivity is gone, because we are talking about persecution, and persecution is very negative, because persecution, especially in those times, often meant death and torture. So that's just not feeling right. But if we would remove verse 11 and 12, Then there is another context for the Greek word that's translated as persecuted in verse 10, and that context comes from the positivity of verses 3 to 9. And that means that verse 10 could be translated positive too, using pursue. And that just makes a whole lot more sense. And I think that many would be willing to accept this translation, but the main stumbling block for them is, and should be, I should say, that it should not be taken lightly to remove two verses from the Bible. That's always a thing you have to consider well. It's not like, oh, this does not fit in my doctrine, so let's remove a few verses that conflict with my doctrine. So I can really understand that you are very reluctant or just totally unwilling to remove those verses. So I would just say, well, this teaching is a suggestion that the translation also could be different, more positive, just something for you to consider. So a little study for you, if you want to. Matthew 5, verse 3 until 10. And then replace verse 10 with the verse 10 that's listed at the bottom of this video. And just read and study and see if it feels right in your heart, in your spirit, in your mind, that verse 10 really fits with verse 3 to 9 if it's translated as pursue, as a happy, positive verse. Okay, this concludes this week's teaching, and I hope to see you next Friday.